Hello and welcome back to part 3 of the figure painting tutorial workshop. And in this part we're going to paint another figure, but we're gonna go about it a little bit of a different way. So here I have my reference of the figure I'm going to paint. Again, this is a photograph by Anton Belovodchenko, and the links to his galleries are in the description below. But for this figure, we're actually gonna paint without an initial sketch. So we're gonna start off with the dark value and paint the light values in. So building from dark to light. And the purpose of doing this is to really focus on the shapes that the light makes on the figure, and to build it up from sort of a mid-tone to and build the light on top of it, rather than going from light to dark. This also just works how you measure proportion and stuff without delineating everything with a line drawing. So let's get into it. Starting off with a canvas that's 11 by 17 at 300 dpi, so 11 by 17 inches. And I have my reference here in a second file. So basically, what we're going to do is try to find the shapes that the light makes on the figure, and start by painting these shapes as a block in, and then as we mark them out, we can build up the sort of transitions and the gradients within those shapes and sculpt them out. And we almost won't touch any of the dark areas till maybe the very end, just to add some reflected light and some of the really dark occluded shadows. So in this tutorial, I don't think I'll speak as much as the demo in part 2, just because talking is quite distracting, and I want to get through this one a little bit faster than the 3 hours that were spent on the last one. So if you get bored of the silence, you can always skip through it, or put some music on it on top of, or listen to your own music, and or you can just also speed up the video and to see this whole process kind of at twice the rate. But if anything pops up, if anything important comes up, I'll definitely address it. And so again, I'm just going to use my sort of standard round brush. Where is it here? The round textured. So it's just a round brush at about 50% hardness, with a little bit of texture. And I don't want to start too light. I want to start just around a mid-tone value. We can build up to the brightest tones. But the nice thing about this technique too is that you can sort of see the figure develop almost out of thin air. And it's a way of blocking in all the shapes really quickly. I have a soft brush as an eraser, so that I don't get too harsh lines if I have to erase. I was also planning on doing this on one layer, but I think for the very first block in, I'm gonna do it on a second layer just so I can then center it before merging it all down and fix any major proportional changes. So you can see already the form is starting to develop. So now I don't know how long it's been, a few minutes, but basically have the form blocked out. And now I can go in and build up the tones even more, build up the relief of the musculature and the different landmarks. And I'll switch over to a harder eraser so I can start to define my the edge. Actually, I'm going to merge down everything to one layer over here and just really focus on color picking from around the canvas to pick my values and build up the form that way rather than continually jumping over to the color picker. Also turn my flow down so it's easier to control. Yeah, lowering that flow really just helps you control how much pressure you need to put down and how many passes. Like if your flow is all the way up to 100%, if you press as hard as you can, that's as opaque that stroke will get. But if you turn it down to about 30%, the first pass will be a lot softer, and then the second pass it takes a few passes to get 100% opacity. So that's all it really does is, and as opposed to the opacity where if you turn the opacity down, you can go back and forth as much as possible, but it'll never build up. So that's why I just bring the flow down. There's a sort of soft crease running down the spine before near the edge of the ribs has a core shadow. Needs to be slightly darker. And you have the lats getting compressed by the arm. And cast shadow here. And I'm paying attention to these edges around here. I don't want all my edges to be hard delineations. I'll let some of them fade into the background because I'm working on one layer. That'll sort of give a softness to some of the regions around the figure. And the reason I want to get through this figure a little quicker is just that there's some really fun stuff that you can do to liven up the sort of final drawing and make it more interesting. And work on some areas that are a little more eye-catching, that have a little more contrast. So I wanted to showcase that a little more than I did in my last video, because I was sort of taking a long time, and I didn't want the video to last like 5 hours. So I might draw in a little bit with the light color before painting, just so that I get the region correct. And this Actually, it's worth mentioning that this technique of only painting in the light comes from a traditional painting method called chiaroscuro, or the clair obscur, which I mean, Caravaggio was very well known for it, but the sort of candlelit scene with one light source, one direct light source, and then all the shadows melt into darkness. So none of those none of the shadow areas were ever defined because there was no real reflected light. And but it showed it was a really beautiful way of showing the form with the one light source. I'm also trying not to zoom in too much at this stage, so that I don't get bogged down in detail. I'm just trying to start to model the form with broad strokes. To try to get you want to try to get as much done with as big of a brush as possible before moving on to a smaller brush and start defining details. And that'll not only make your brushwork more interesting, but it'll also save you a lot of time instead of going over with a small brush and trying to paint, that way. Even though I can't really get a hard or sharp edge with this brush, but I can always go in and sharpen up those edges later. And a useful thing too for your brushwork is always work with the form. So if the form is going around like this on the leg and around here, if you want to add a highlight, you can sort of go lengthwise, but to work this way, at least with your final brush marks, to have the grain of the brush sort of working with the form will really help sell the shapes. So sometimes I'll lay down an area quickly, like block out the main value with sort of whichever brush stroke will cover the most area the fastest. But in the final stages of the brushwork, I'll go over sort of transversely, just so that the grain of the brush really shows the form. And I might even go over with like I really like this square paint brush to do that sort of thing, because it has a pretty sharp edge. So as you draw along this way, you have the grain of the brush sort of following the form. And what that looks like on here is it almost mimics like hatching. And then in the darker areas, I'll always work with the grain. Actually, I'll just continue with this for now. Because the brush doesn't, the brush doesn't really matter. Just pick whatever works for you. I'll sort of switch the brush sets almost every day, or make new brushes and then trash them and try something different if I feel like a brush is working against me. I want the reflected light under her leg to be really subtle. And I'll just, I switched brushes there, but it's just because I wasn't getting the marks that I wanted. They were a little too harsh. Actually, I'm going to... So there I just bumped the levels of all the grays because they're too dark overall. And it's making it hard to build up to the lightest value that I want. Have the shoulder on the far side, which makes a little crease here with the trap that's intersecting, or that's inserting into the top of the scapula, which has a sort of ridge here. And we have a sharp crease here as well, where because the traps are sort of like a big diamond that sort of connect up the on the neck, on the top of the neck, right where the cranium meets the first vertebrae. So that's why there's this dark line. And this part catches the light, but because overall the back is round and the light source is coming from here, this highlight here isn't gonna get as bright. It's not gonna get the same brightness as this one here. So be careful of not pushing too much contrast into that area. Because relatively it will look as bright. Like it'll look like the same local color. It'll just look like the figure is, or the form is turning away from the light. And here I need to exaggerate the shape of the spine a little more. Oh. Sorry if you can hear cars and honking and beeping. I live in a crazy part of the city, and it was raining earlier, so I had my windows open. Six ribs. Starting here. Just want to get the right number of ribs in so that it still conforms to the right sort of anatomy. And they are really exaggerated here. I'll soften them up in a minute. The last one down there. And I'll soften them up because you have the lats running over them, or you have at least on the side here, and then you have your obliques under, which sort of start in between the ribs. Go over with a soft brush and help round the overall shape of it out a little bit. Here accentuating the core shadow and darkening the bottom of them so they turn into the back. And here, make that area a little lower contrast. I really like this reference because you can see the anatomy pretty clearly. It's a pretty athletic build, and especially when there's a lot of tension in the back. So the skin is very much stretched. To adjust the line of this. Also we'll draw the head in a couple seconds, or a couple minutes. So that little line right there is making the scapula pop out, because the shoulder is the shoulder girdle is sort of rotating in front of the ribs. So from the top view, it would look like you have your rib cage and the sort of neck area, the sternum, and you have the clavicles that sort of wrap around the neck, and on the other side you have the scapulas, and then your shoulder girdle is sort of here. So as they come forward, the scapulas will sort of flare out like this way as the shoulders come forward, because they all have to stay attached, and the clavicles will also rotate. So to show that, I'm giving just a little bit of space between the ridge of the scapula. And this is like one of the parts in the anatomy that I want to emphasize on this figure. Is this whole region here? I think it's the sort of focal area. So spending a little more time to define what's going on, because there's some pinching between the muscles and the muscles and the bones that are protruding, and there are some nice divots and some nice creasing happening. I just want to push this spine a little, or make that crease a little more significant. I don't want the line to be completely straight, because you would be able to see the sort of relief of the vertebrae. This area, and then you're pushing the other side of this trap and melting it into the background, because I don't want none of this to show up. Because without, I mean, none of the shadow is present here, and still you can read the form, because we're so used to seeing humans we know what they look like. So we sort of, our mind sort of completes the picture, and without actually explicitly showing this. And even if you want to like really accentuate that, it's sort of the idea that like if you draw 4 lines here, you can see a square without it having to be completely closed off. So if you show just enough, sort of like where something starts and where something ends, you can sort of make up the line in between both. So all we really need to show the profile of the back here, like all we need to suggest, is a little bit of reflected light somewhere, or even some contrast against the background. Like if the background here has is just a touch lighter, and it sort of fades off like this, we can see where the back belongs, and that's just by drawing the sort of negative shape. And same here, even if something even more subtle is the hand is coming through the back here, and if we just add this shape, that's breaking up the background on this side, because we know that the arm is wrapping around here. We almost don't have to indicate anything except for the main shape, except for this shape here, to say that the arm is crossing through the back. Here, there's a really nice crease, a sharp crease where the tricep is pushing against her back. And this is sort of something I'll do a lot, is if you have a cylinder, or if you want to show a cylinder, you sort of draw the main highlight down the length of it, and then you go across it to feather the that highlight on each side. So you finish it transversely, and then if you want to come down and work the edge, you can come back with the each side of it. So this is what I'm doing here. I'm sort of dragging down this highlight color all the way to the elbow, and sort of marking where that elbow is going to be, and then I'm coming back to sort of feather the highlight to the degree I want, because it does taper towards the elbow like that. And you have some other muscle groups. The elbow is, or the arm is almost hyperextended. So there's a sharp crease at the elbow. And then again for the arm, I'm drawing out the main highlight and sort of feathering it. There's also some reflected light back here from, I guess, a secondary light source. Maybe it's a window or... started that highlight just a tad low. And here for the hands, nothing special, just trying to indicate the main shapes. There's the sort of wrist bone which protrudes out on the pinky side, which is pretty apparent here. And the hand sort of dips down. I think Bridgman has a really elegant way of explaining the sort of rhythms of the hand, where you have the wrist. A lot of people will draw hands that sort of come out straight, and then you have the fingers that come out straight as well. But there's this really elegant gesture that hands make, and if you put your hand out sideways, it's really subtle, but where the bone in the wrist meets the sort of phalanges, it sort of dips down and sort of creates this stepping motion. So you can almost think of the wrist that's coming down, and the muscles in the hand sort of dip down, and it's almost like this this wave that happens. The hand, you can exaggerate it like this, but if you had let's say the underside of the hand, if it was sort of a bottom view, you have you can make really gestural hands this way just by having that little dip in the wrist. It sort of starts this like rapid. I'm just trying to indicate this slightly with how it dips down and then the hand flares out. There's a dip until the first knuckle. Actually, I'll move this whole thing. Back just slightly. back to this hand in a little bit. Okay, now let's block in hair again. She has her hair up in a bun, so I'm just trying to find the highlights. It's kind of funny how little it takes to trick the eye into thinking that there's something there. So if you sort of work smarter, just a little bit smarter, you can really save yourself a whole lot of time in rendering the shapes. Like you can make out the form just with a couple indications of where the light is hitting. And there's also light catching just the back of the ear on this side. From the back ears, I think of ears as like trumpets almost. They have this like I mean it's sort of a cartoony representation, but they sort of have this shape where they connect to the skull. It's almost like the tip of a balloon. And yeah, I almost don't have to indicate anything else. Maybe a little section where the skin sort of frees up behind the ear. This is a pretty impressionistic way of going about painting, where you're laying down, like I mean like in the hair region, not really for the rest of the body, but you can see the size of brush I'm using, and I'm just laying down some quick sort of textural brush strokes to give the impression of baby hairs or some sort of rougher surface, rather than going in and drawing like, you know, every single baby hair. Like this would take an eternity. Although, you know, putting one or two of them in, it will catch your eye because it's detail. But mixing a little bit of both can really sort of, it has like gives interest to your painting. Now, this head is not going the direction I want it to because I did not place these highlights right. So right now I have the impression that it's looking a little more that way than I want it to. I want her to look more down. So I think I need to fix a sort of silhouette read of the head. that little mark here behind the ear. Here you go. So I haven't even laid in my darkest darks, and already we're getting a pretty good read on the form, a good idea of where things are, and we can sort of push things with the sort of darkest darks. This dark is just a shade or two darker than my background, which will be nice for showing the very occluded areas. So this is the oblique here, which is sort of catching a highlight. Some of these areas are still too high contrast, and because I laid them out with a textured brush, you can see there's a lot of texture in these areas, which I find a little distracting. I'm going to make the skin a little rougher than it needs to be, so I'll just go in and color pick in those areas the values that I want and sort of glaze over it. To get rid of some of that texture. Now I'm coming in with a soft brush, same purpose. Just getting rid of some of the texture and softening out the shapes. And add just a little bit of bloom on that highlight on the knee. So that's a focal point. And here, I want this to be quite a sharp edge. So add this in. That separates that back leg even more. These are pretty sharp. Pretty sharp line. So here I zoomed in on my reference just a little bit so that I can start adding in a touch more detail to these feet. So there are these nice, really subtle creases and folds that are happening because she's pointing her feet, so right in the back of the ankle. Don't want to be too harsh with my brush strokes because it is still one continuous surface. And there's a really subtle overlap of forms where this muscle and the top of the foot, there's an intersection like this, but it's really subtle. But that just shows that the sort of pinky foot or pinky toe sort of wrapping around. Here, and the second toe. Come and grab my darkest color and sort of show the back end of the foot. That's pretty much the back leg, and then the front leg, there's a couple little bumps and stuff to show. So I don't want to create a smooth curve here. There are sort of these ridges that that happen with because there's multiple bones in the foot. So I'm trying to create these sort of almost like waves where it sort of hits a peak and then sort of droops down and then hits another peak with really subtle value changes. There's a bit of a dip. And the second one. The reason I'm going into more detail here is just because it's it'll draw your eye to it, and yeah, it's sort of a termination point for your eye, because it's sort of the end of the legs, and will sort of stop your eye, and then make it turn around and flow back into the image. It's sort of it's partly a compositional strategy, but also it's a way of suggesting that there's more detail in the entirety of the image. If you detail a few of the important spots, it sort of looks like the whole thing is more detailed than it actually is. Like all this leg stuff is not really detailed. I mean, the values are generally in the right place, but it terminates. The detail slowly builds up towards the end, and that sort of suggests that there's more detail in the whole leg. Okay, I'm gonna figure out pads of the feet. Same in this area. I don't want to make it perfectly smooth because toes, like hands, also have knuckles. So the phalanges leading up to them, I don't know if they're called phalanges, but this sort of metacarpal foot bones are a little smoother in shape, but then they get to a knuckle. Okay, and actually I wasn't in the right place. Still don't think it's in the right place. Here I'm just pulling some of these highlights. I need to soften this contour here. So that's a little too harsh. You can see from further away, these are plenty detailed, except they're too small. I still need to lighten up the overall value. So what I'm gonna do is duplicate the layer and drag my grays up. And this is almost gonna act like a screen. So you can see how that lightens all the value, but I don't want it on my background as well, so I'm going to add a layer mask and invert it, and then I'll paint it in the area. So on my layer mask, I'll select white to paint it in, and then here you can see as I paint it in, it sort of brightens everything slightly. So I'm basically lowering the contrast in the bright areas where I want. think the feet are plenty bright, so I won't touch those. And I'm also going to liquefy this because there are some things. I mean, traditionally, I would just repaint them or paint over them, but in Photoshop has magical tools, so I will use them. Just make the scapula turn over a little bit more and adjust the sort of shape. Contours give a little more definition. Those muscles. I know these fingers look all wonky, but let's see. So these are the changes. Whoops. Oh dear, what did I do? Oh man, did I just lose my... Yeah, okay, there you go. I want there to be a contour there. Like I want you to see this edge here, but just so faintly. I feel like this arm is long. A little bit. Just fix up those edges. And here I'm going to focus on adding one more level of detail and contrast. Same reason I did on the feet, just to give the suggestion that the entirety of the arm is a little more detailed than it actually is. This repositioning, this highlight. I'm only going to resolve that one finger. And pinky finger. The rest are just going to be brushwork. One more Anton darker, and I'm going to block out just a really rough shape of the thumb, which will barely be noticeable, but just be enough to sort of figuring out the ground plane. She's casting a shadow. I'm gonna leave this area as a lost edge because it sort of transitions in between the shadow and the background. Take artistic liberty on that, and there's a sharper shadow leading up to the thumb, which is just peeking into the light again. Actually, that could be a so everything here is like just a messy blur. Working these dark on dark areas can be a little tricky if you can't see properly. The smallest amount of glare on your screen will trump your judgment. Okay. So I'm gonna start focusing on some really small details to sharpen up the silhouette and give some really intricate surface detail. So for this, I get pretty zoomed in on what I'm working on, and I try to make just subtle changes to the forms that will just that will only be legible once it all comes together. And kind of feathering some edges, occluding some areas. And this can be an endless process, so I don't want to get too caught up, but I will spend a decent amount of time on this. So here I'm still far, I brightened it up a lot already, but I'm still quite far from my brightest highlights, which would be somewhere around here. So I'm going to start introducing some of those. And this is the sort of stuff like adding a sharp highlight right there and feathering it out quite quickly will really, it just sharpens up that area. this area here, it's soft here, but once it gets to this point, it becomes quite sharp because there's an overlap. But I want that transition to be soft as well. So it sort of comes and goes quickly. I'm moving away slightly from this area just so that I can occlude the transition. And then here I'll add, because the light is coming down and hitting this quite strongly right at this intersection. So there's cast shadow here, but also it'll reflect some light back up into here. I'm just going to go a touch lighter and add some reflected light in here, and the smallest amount right in here. I'm going in and sculpting some pretty specific trailing hairs. And this is why I like to use this brush, because it has some pretty wide streaks to it. sharp crease where the skin is pinching. And just a couple highlights. Here I'm zoomed in on my image just a little more, and now I have a better idea of what's going on with the head and why it's tilted like that. I mentioned in part 2, I'm adding these darker tones in the hair so that it gets a little bit of a glossy effect to it, having the like high contrast between the highlights here and a dark sort of core shadow. Almost give it that like a metallic these little highlights here, basically where you can see skin under the pulled hair. It still isn't doing the right thing. The head is really tilted down. Okay, almost there. Just have to finish off the top of the bun. this a little bit more of a graphic shape because it's really round. Break up the highlight. Okay, I think I figured it out. So here I duplicated this section of the hair and this section of the hair so that I can sort of just warp them into place individually. This one. And I'll just smudge these areas out so that there's no harsh line. I'm sort of in the middle of rendering this. Now I need to push this up. There. Okay, that's a little better. This sort of funky fanning ponytail. Again, just to brighten these up a little bit, I'm just going to go on with an overlay layer and quickly brush over them just to add some nice highlights. You can also do this on the skin, but you have to be careful to not like blow out any areas too much. Like that, and then bring it way down. Okay. So now I'm just going to darken the background in some areas to make to sharpen up some of these edges, because basically I kept them soft so that as I added when I add the dark color in the background, it feathers off, or it gets really dark right before it meets the background. instead of being on white, or instead of the background contrasting against a bright highlight, it's contrasting against a darker color. So there's contrast without it being like too digital. I'm just reworking that edge. Could also do this at the very end with once I'm done coloring, but for the top here, I'm not going to go as dark because I don't want to I still want there to be some contrast against the hair. So sort of lighten it up, and also the light source is coming from this corner, right? It's coming down, so this area is going to be a little brighter, except for maybe a little bit of vignetting. This is a little sharpen up that that highlight, but it's really straight, which I don't like. I'll give it a little bit of curve. This is why reserving your brightest and darkest colors, or giving yourself some leeway to add your brightest and darkest colors at the end is always good. And even these sort of dirty edges, or the lost edges, I'm not going to clean up all of them, just because it adds a little bit of character to the piece. And it doesn't all have to be perfect. That's what I tell myself, so that I can get some sleep at night. I'm just going over these areas to get rid of some of the texture with the soft brush. I don't want to get rid of all of it, but some of it, some of the distracting texture. Is a really soft crease that I'm just going to add in. Plenty. And I'm going to sharpen up this core shadow. You see it's just a little darker than what comes directly after it. And then I have to reinforce this one too, because I lost it. Back 2 seconds, I need to turn the AC on. Here. You can see these small additions cumulatively make quite a difference overall. And now we are, I call this ready to start to color. So as we did in the previous video, I am going to duplicate and give it a cool undertone. Slightly blue purple, set that to color. And I'm going to turn this down a little bit so that it doesn't affect my background so much. It doesn't saturate it so much. But remember that I am working off of a black and white reference, so I'm going to be inventing these colors. I mean, I could pull up another reference with color in it, but I think I'll just, I'm feeling inspired, so I'll invent some colors, just based on my knowledge of how that works. So, because this is all on one layer, I'm going to have to be a little more careful with how I lay down colors so that I don't smudge it all over the background. But I'll start with my reds. I'm toning in, so around the core shadows. And this one, I think I'll do some warmer highlights and cooler shadows, because last time we did warmer shadows and cooler highlights. So also, I think we might have a little more time in this one than the previous video. I might be mistaken though, because I think a couple hours have gone by, but I don't have the time on me. So for here, at the intersection of the hair and the ears, will have some red undertones to it, and the neck. And this whole area here, I'll sort of accentuate these ribs, because every rib basically has a tiny little core shadow to it, which I want to darken. I just want to give a really deep vibrance to the skin. At least that's what I like about rendering skin or colorizing skin, is that just with some small hue shifts you can really add a lot of depth. So I don't want to get too much in the shadow area. Nope, don't want my navigator. And feet get quite red, but they're more of a, it might be a more of an orange red in this one. So I am starting off with a more desaturated palette, or a warmer palette with a more desaturated, cool undertone. So this is more orange red than a pink red. But again, where the, even if I'm doing warm highlights and cool shadows, where the reflected light does bounce back into the skin, it will get really saturated. So I'm just keeping an eye out for those areas. You can hear, because the light is coming down, bouncing off the tricep into the back. There'll be a more saturated, warm color in that area. Same thing for these shadows here. I think in the hair I'll have some greens and some oranges. And so for this hand, I don't want to draw too much attention to it. Because the focus needs to stay on the back and the knee. So I will not add so much saturation on it. I'll sort of build up the saturation in this area here. I don't want to go too yellow right now. I want to sort of build it up, so go through the reds and then the orangey reds and the orange yellows, and then get into the yellows. So this is sort of a peach color, which is pretty close to red. Should I pull that even more? And this is the part where you can really mess around with the nuances of the warm and cool colors, because you have so much control having all your colors on a different layer and not affecting your values. So like this reflected light under the scapula here, I'll probably bring a tone cooler just so that it contrasts the warm colors around it. And to do that, I don't necessarily want to, throw blue in it or green or purple. I just need to throw like a more desaturated, a very desaturated red in it, and you can see that in relation to the colors around it, it almost looks blue, where it's still sort of orange. That's because it's about their relation to the colors around them, and not necessarily what they are in themselves. It's how they work in the context of the greater painting. So you can see I'm leaving some areas like this. I'm just not touching them because I sort of like the cool tones that they have. And I'll let the darks sort of fade into the background. This is getting progressively more in shadow, so I don't want to go too overboard. I might erase some of that away. Well, see in a bit. And this in a personal piece, this would not be the last stage. I know in the last demo, once I colorized it, I called it done. But for a personal piece, I would go over and paint in color over the whole thing, adding more nuances and blending out the brush strokes and stuff a little better. You can see I'm only keeping these saturated colors in the highlights for now. Might introduce some in the shadows later, just to balance things out. But the important thing is, well, for me right now, is just to get the highlights right, on the principle that the shadows don't matter that much, because they'll just fade into the background. A little more red in the knees. This is my just my base sort of skin tone from this base, because it's just a a color, I can go to any type of skin tone that I want. There's enough variation in color and in cool and warm colors that, you know, it can go more yellow, it can go more green, it can go darker, lighter. So I'm just sort of setting up the base palette. It's the wonder, one of the wonders of working digitally again, is that it's super flexible. You're not really constrained to anything as long as you know Photoshop well enough. There's ways of working non-destructively and going all over all sorts of places with your piece without really damaging anything. So you can always go back and you can preserve the work you did beforehand. We're moving into some more yellows. I mean, already, if I wanted, I could just start color balancing and going all the way to something really macabre like this. Actually, this is sort of interesting. Let's go down. Let's go down this route. But the one thing I do, so let's say this is like, it's almost like albino, and there's some interesting greens and stuff happening in this skin tone, which I like. But to complement that, because it's a more greeny yellow, I'm gonna take some pinks, some really light pinks, and just lay them in some areas that I think could use them. But it'll just add, I'll sort of scatter it around so that there's an interplay between the pinks and the greens. So basically complementaries, right? So pink is like a light red, and these sort of warm greens are complementary to it. Or the cool greens, like the sort of turquoises and blues that you see here. So having those two colors sort of bounce off each other is nice. And I try to focus on the areas of high contrast. So having like an interplay of color in an open sort of area like this is fine, but you won't see it as much as if I were to lay down some more saturated colors in high contrast areas. So that's why I'm focusing on the transition areas between light and dark to push that interplay of colors. And then sort of scattering it in between. I mean, this isn't really a really realistic skin tone, but it's something I really like doing. Sort of a stylized, surreal version of what skin would do. And I mean, that's sort of your job as an artist, is to give your own interpretation to the things you're illustrating or drawing. I mean, this is a study, so you can choose to interpret as much as you want, to add your own flavor to it as much as you want, or you can just go and copy pixel for pixel if you're focusing on training your eye. But I really like the properties of skin and how light plays off of it, and I want to show what I like about it. I want to, like, you know, I want to show what I think is cool and make people see what is cool about skin or what it can do, which is why I go an extra step and to focus on the color and all these like really subtle things. You see once I flip this layer on and off. You can see it. It just adds a little bit of a little some. I can introduce a little more of these pinks in the hands, just because it's a closer, it's closer to the cool color of blue, so it won't draw so much attention. So there. Let's do that, and you can see if I really saturate it, you can see all the different colors that are actually in here. There's greens, there's yellows, there's oranges, reds, purples, blues. So there's a whole sort of color wheel, just in different amounts, and you can see how desaturated it is. But if I saturate it just a tad and shift those hues around, you can see that you can get all sorts of different color combinations. Or if you pull up your color balance wheel, you can also, push the coolness or the warm tones of your color in whichever direction you want. I sort of like how cool and desaturated it is, so I'm gonna keep that sort of in this area. Maybe even bring it down a little bit. I think it's just a little, it brings a little bit of melancholy almost. And then the hairs, and bring some greens again. If you look at black hair in white light, you'll often see browns and greens and blues in the highlights. So I think this is appropriate. But it's not, you can see how desaturated the green is. I mean, it's nowhere close to being fully saturated, but it really doesn't take much. If you're really loud with all your colors, like if you're making every single color you put down really saturated, then all the colors seem to flatten, because it's just like noise. And but if you're really subtle with your colors, it kind of makes the audience pay a little closer attention. Kind of like if you're playing music really softly, everybody will sort of listen closer. So staying pretty desaturated with your colors, and then using a couple just like booster colors in the areas you need to draw attention will those colors will just be amplified by the lack of other saturated colors in the image. I'm going to try one thing. Where is my selective color? I'm going to find my blues or my cyans. I'm going to desaturate my cyans. So basically the background color, I'm going to push it elsewhere. So I find it was a little too blue. There. Okay, so I got a pretty solid base down. I'm going to do a couple things. These are the sort of final little tweaks that I didn't really do on my previous one, which I wanted to talk about in this video. And you can do, and these are just a couple tricks, a couple Photoshop tricks to bring attention to the areas that you want. First thing is, once you get all your base colors and stuff down, you should probably go over and continue painting in color, just so that you have some brush strokes that are actually, that have to do with the color that you're putting down. So you don't just have colors transitioning between all sorts of your previous brush strokes, but you have some brush strokes which have purpose in their color. And but I don't think I'll do too much of that. But the other thing I wanted to do is, you can do a sort of sharpen layer where you go over areas you want to sharpen with the sharpen tool. So that's this tool down here. If you go to smudge, there's sharpen right here. And if you use I like to use a soft brush. And if you just brush over some of these areas, like if you go really, really hard, this is what it does. Sort of like blasts out. It sort of burns the image. But if you just go over it subtly, it can sort of just augment the contrast a little bit. You can also make sort of highlights pop. So I like to go over some of these areas, and it's really, really subtle. Like, it doesn't do much in the grand scheme of things, but areas like this, you know, it can make quite a difference. Just having it pop out a little bit. See, it just makes the earring pop. And then the second thing is you can do like a quick sort of specular pass, and this is one of my favorite tricks if you ever want to make surfaces that are like shiny or that just have a high specularity. And this is for not only like figures, but you can use this on leather or metal or like hard plastics and stuff. But here you have a sort of a tonal range already, a value range, and you just want to boost the brightest brights without affecting anything else, just to give it a sharp specular highlight. So what I do is I duplicate the layer, and this is I'm thinking that the highlight here is going to be like a cool light or made from a white light, so I'll completely desaturate that layer because I want it to be white, not like orange or another color. And then I set this to pin light, and that should do absolutely nothing because pin light will only really affect the difference of colors if the values are different. So what I do in this case, let's save my file because I'm getting spazzing out. So what I do is I pull up the levels on this black and white layer, and if I push the grays up, you can see what happens to the highlights as they get much brighter. But if you push them up just a little bit and then you push up the whites, you can sort of adjust it so that you're just getting a sort of specular sheen on everything. And you can make it, you can control it and make it as sharp or as soft as you want. So this is one way of sort of making, you can just give a slicker surface to the skin, or any material that has like a specular highlight on it. So let's say that's what I want from it, and I can just like desaturate it or lower the opacity on that layer because I don't want it to be that bright. I just want it to have like the smallest little kick. So do that. Oh, and you can, if you want to colorize it, you can also colorize it and make it blue, or you can make it red. You can make it whatever color you want, but I'm just gonna keep it black and white. So I'll do that. And then what was the last thing I wanted to do? Oh yeah, and then you can do like if I'm calling this my final image, I might sign it. But I'd go into first I'd resize it, because if you're posting it anywhere, an image that's 5,000 pixels wide is like ultra HD, and it might not open easily. So what I do is like if you want it to be just HD, which is 920 pixels wide, or ultra HD, so double that, you can just go into image size, and then make sure this is locked. Set this to 1920. Okay. And if you want to preserve the detail as you go down, you just here in resample, you just make sure it's in bicubic sharper reduction, like because you're reducing the scale or the size of the image. So I just have that in place, but I'm just only going to reduce it to around 2500 so that I still have some resolution. And then I might throw a little bit of a sharpen filter on it. So you can either do like sharpen more, or an unsharp mask if you really want a lot of control over it. But this will just sharpen up some of those highlights, and you can see this is pretty drastic. But if I just reduce the amount, it just gives a nice little sharp edge to everything that I want to be in focus. And that's really it. Because because there's a threshold on that sharpen, I can always work over it in the areas that aren't so sharp, just to clean up some lines. Which I kind of rushed through last time, but I did still want to take the time to make these nice images, not just for the demo's sake, but you know, to practice my figure painting, because it never gets old, never gets easy. I mean, you might get a better result, but it still takes a lot of concentration. Every time I paint a figure, I learn something new. Or it points out what I'm lacking in. I mean, most of the time these days I find I just lack patience. I want to get things done fast, which is not great for trying to achieve a really high standard, because that just takes time. So I think this video is definitely starting to run longer than the previous one, but I guess I won't know until I stop the recording. But I'm in no rush. So and YouTube has this awesome feature that you can speed up the videos to twice as fast, so feel free to do so if you want to just see this in time lapse and hear me talk really fast. I think this piece is starting to draw to an end. But all the artworks I do these days, they feel like you just go on forever. There's always something to fix. I wish I could just go over every pixel and be like, okay, I've looked at every single pixel, it's time to call it done. But then you notice that some areas aren't working with others and you want to retouch them, or I mean, I definitely don't draw enough feet, so I guess I'll spend a little more time just to focus on those. Feet are like hands, right? Like, if you think hands are hard to draw, because they are. I mean, they're really complex shape. Feet are the same thing, and we tend to neglect them even more because they're close to the ground and we don't see them often unless you're doing figure painting. way too rumply bumpy. So that's the thing with working close too zoomed in, is you make everything a little more high contrast than it should be. So I'm just trying to lower the contrast of all those bumps I made. My sink just made a really freaky Monster of the Black Lagoon sound. Okay. This color scheme does seem pretty dead though, so I'm going to add one more pass. Of reds. And I only really want them to be affecting the midtone, so I'll show in a minute or so how to do that. Because now I'm sort of putting it all over the place like a big wash. Add it in one area, definitely add it in another. So for this area, I'm going to double click on the layer, like not on this layer. Well, you could, I guess. But under Blend If, you can choose how the layer blends to the bottom layer with these sliders. So, so for this layer, I only want to blend if it's in the midtones. So I could crank. You can see if you look on the feet. If I bump this value up, it's not blending at all to the darks anymore. And if I bring this down, the highlights all the way down, it's not blending to the lights. But that's a really harsh edge. But the trick is if you find a sort of nice area like this, I only want it to blend there, you can press on Alt and click and it'll split that point and it'll actually make it blend between these two grays. so you can create a soft transition, like a gradient, right? So now that instead of it being a really harsh line, it blends off and is only affecting the midtones. So I'm going to erase some of this away. Just making it a tad bit more orange overall. And that's it. Crop it in a tiny bit so that I lose those weird edges, those weird pixelated edges. That's my final image. Okay, so yeah, so thank you for listening in on this third demo, or the second demo, the third part of the workshop. And I hope, again, you enjoyed and learned something from this. So a little bit of a different technique this time, but also applicable and very useful in learning how to sculpt directly with light and without an underlying drawing. So yeah, get to practicing, and I'll see you in the final demo in the next video, where I'll try to explore a different technique or have a different sort of approach for the final figure. Okay, thanks a lot, and see you next time.